Hi, I'm Kurania. I'm a TNT runner with over 10,000 wins, and this guide was made by me with some help and input from some of the best players in the game. This includes players like Domo, Shiny, Cool, and Diablo, so I'd like to give a shout out and a thank you to them for their help in this video. First off, I'd like to clarify what this video is about. In this video, I'll be explaining to the best of my ability what the main skills of TNT Run are, and when I explain each of them, I'll try to explain how you can use an understanding of these skills to understand and improve in TNT Run yourself as you go along your TNT Run journey. Keep in mind I'm describing these and how they apply to 1v1s and not pro player parties. With that being said, I'd like to establish the first important concept when looking at 1v1s, the three stages of a game. They call it the early game, the mid game, and the late game. You might have heard these terms thrown around before, but what do they actually mean? The start of the early game is obvious, when the game starts of course, but when does it end? In my opinion, the definition I'm going to go for in this video is the early game ends and the mid game begins as soon as the optimal decision for a player is to use a double jump to move to a different section of blocks. This does mean, yes, that on Greenbelt the mid-game can start 15 minutes into the map, or on Templar 10 seconds into the map, the Kurania method. I use this as the definition of the beginning of the mid-game, as when the mid-game begins, decision making becomes a relevant skill and this can't happen until you have to make a decision, i.e. double jump up a layer, or to a different location. The line between the mid-game and the late game to me is a bit more blurry, but in my opinion, the late game roughly begins when the optimal decision is to go to a location with less than 10 blocks. The late game can be very crucial because it requires players to make decisions considering a lot of options very fast. It can often lead to players making much more mistakes as matches reach their intense finale. Now, it's time to talk about the 5 skills themselves. The 5 skills of TNT Run are Parkour, Cutting, B2B, Decision Making, and Pathfinding. Parkour in the TNT Run sense can be defined as the ability to run around in TNT Run without falling. So, every time you fall in TNT Run on an accident, whether it be a 2-block jump or a hyper-geo double neo, that is a parkour error that will result in a weakness in your parkour ability. However, the two situations I just described are very different in terms of difficulty and frequency. In a TNT Run match, you can have 100 2-block jumps, but you may only come across a hyper-geo neo every 20 matches. This is why I like to subdivide the skill of Parkour into 2 different sub-skills, Parkour Consistency and Parkour Mastery. In my opinion, Parkour Consistency is the most important thing to focus on for beginners and intermediate players, as the amount of double jumps wasted by mistakes on simple Parkour is a difference maker in many games at this skill level. Parkour Consistency is trained by raw experience usually, and has a higher correlation with win count than most other skills in this video. Players who in my opinion demonstrate Parkour consistency include old players like Mr. Neropian or Chipmunk, for example, as well as of course all the top players in the game today who have essentially mastered this skill. Parkour Mastery on the other hand is a much more niche sub-skill that isn't applicable in most games. It is your ability to tackle the hardest jumps in TNT Run and make them at a higher percentage. Some maps test this more than others, for example, downvolt neos and hypergeos double neos. This is a skill that isn't easy to practice in TNT Run itself, but jumps like those are common in parkours that can be played for example in Hypixel's housing. Many TNT runners have or know people who have housings that test these kinds of jumps, so if you want to work on this, just ask around. Examples of players who demonstrate this skill very well are Shiny and Sean. Cutting can be defined as the ability to purposefully run over blocks with the intention of stopping another player from stepping on them, either to make them fall or to force them to take a different path. This is a good description of cutting offense, but cutting defense, which is your ability to not get cut off by other players, is just as important, if not more important, than cutting offense. You could say cutting defense is part of cutting skills, or you could say they're part of parkour consistency skills, but this is an arbitrary line. Players who, in my opinion, demonstrate excellent cutting defense are Thim and Diablo127, whereas players who demonstrate great cutting offense are Cool Survivor and Pavasniva. And here are some cutting strategies and terms that you should be familiar with. Hawkeye. The Hawkeye is an infamous cutting strategy where a player who is a layer higher than their opponent drops down in front of the opponent, usually on the block they're about to step on, in order to make them fall. Players who are good at this can scare the players below them to the point where they are too scared to B2B their blocks effectively. These are often done in the early game. The cutback. This is a term I thought of for this video. Is when your opponent cuts you off, so you double jump past them and cut them back, which is possible due to double jumps moving you faster than a normal player. A particular place where cutbacks are effective can be in situations on the second last layer of Pacific. Land control. Land control is the concept of controlling how much land you have relative to your opponent by cutting off paths connecting different parts of the map. Cuts that are done in locations far away from your opponent are considered land control cuts. Land control requires players to be acutely aware of the situation, and both their own and their opponent's position on the map, which makes it important in matches with top players. Some maps are more land control focused than others, for example Noozle and Relic. Cutting duel. A cutting duel is when two players are close to each other and are both playing with the intent to cut each other off and not fall themselves, with both players fighting to get an advantage in some form. With all these different techniques and strategies, it can be hard to know where to begin practicing this skill. One tip I would have for intermediate players is to play in F5 and practice being able to play normally like this, so when you're in a cutting duel you can toggle it and it allows you to see all the blocks around you and for your vision to not be blocked by other players. You can use this information to move backwards or to the side, which other players rarely expect. Also, try to watch footage of great cutters to see the situations in which they are able to find cuts, and of course, like everything, practice. B2B is probably the most controversial skill on this list, because in the past B2Bing was viewed as unfun and toxic, but the community has grown to realize it should be valued as a competitive skill. B2B is short for block to block, and can be defined as the ability to jump from block to block as slowly as possible. In my opinion, there are two sub-skills of B2B, B2B speed and B2B consistency. B2B speed is the sub-skill of being able to B2B at a very slow pace, and is much easier the higher ping you have, as blocks take longer to disappear. B2B consistency is a sub-skill of being able to B2B without falling. Being able to B2B at slow speeds is irrelevant if you don't have B2B consistency, and being able to B2B consistently is ineffective if you do it at very fast speeds. Players who are great at B2B include Sean, Thim and LifeWW. It's pretty easy to understand how B2B works, and to improve at it, in my opinion, it just takes lots of practice. So try and be aware of the order your fingers press the buttons on your keyboard, whether you press spacebar before or after W or at the same time, and what works best for you. This differs between players, and as a method of practice, as you are beginning to learn to B2B, you should do it on empty layers or pieces of land with no threats of players cutting you. An easy way to set this up is by playing matches on big maps and B2B on the high layers, and try to do it as slowly as you can without falling. This is good as it lowers the stakes and consequences if you make a mistake. But as you improve, you should start applying it to 1v1s and pro play parties, so you can also improve your ability to react to players coming to your blocks, and how to apply this to actual scenarios. The final two skills I'm going to talk about are decision making and pathfinding. Whereas parkour, cutting and B2B are considered mechanical skills that are determined by how well you can interpret information and control your fingers, I consider decision making and pathfinding mental or theoretical concepts. Decision making is used to describe the decisions you make with double jumps and positioning yourself on the maps, whereas pathfinding describes the specific blocks you choose to jump on and the order you choose to clear them. Decision making is decisions on the macro scale, whereas pathfinding concerns the decisions you make on the micro scale. As I said before, decision making can be defined as the skill of making the best decisions with double jumps and positioning yourself on the map. The classic questions of decision making is, do I go up or do I go down? Do I stay on this side or cross to my opponent? Great decision makers are very aware of their own and their opponent's position on the map, and are constantly re-evaluating which decisions are better in the long term, and where they should go when they are done with their blocks. Each map has a different trends and with what decisions you should be considering, and in no two games are decisions you need to make exactly the same, because blocks are always left in random different patterns. Like everything else on this list, decision making is improved by focused practice. You can also gain an understanding of it by watching high level games. It is also important to note that it is bad to always make the same decision. You should be evaluating the players and the blocks rather than just remembering something like go up from second last of Mars, for example. Pathfinding can be defined as a skill to best decide the path of blocks to take. As a beginner, when your parkour consistency is bad, pathfinding isn't very important, because to survive longer, it's better to focus on not falling, by picking the easiest block to jump to, but this can often lead to dead ends and have you waste double jumps. For players at intermediate and higher levels, once you have mastered all the simple jumps in TNT Run, it becomes an important skill to step on blocks in the most efficient order as to minimize double jump usage and to maximize the times that it takes for a section of blocks to be used. Good pathfinding is when you choose to run across blocks in a more difficult and unintuitive order, to leave a path to a different section, and use every available block. It can also include decisions of which blocks to fall onto to start your path around an area. Pathfinding has a higher correlation with parkour skill, and once you're good at parkour, you'll improve at pathfinding by just practicing it in TNT Run. It is very important in late games and high pressure scenarios. Another tip that was sent to me by Domotron is that when you are playing in general and you've also got a good hold of your parkour abilities, you should consider tilting your head more upwards so you can see more of the blocks and more of the map around you. This can make a big difference in how easy it is to know which path to take. And he also provided this diagram to demonstrate some good pathfinding. Back in 2015, none of these 1v1 concepts were really truly understood. But the players, who had thousands of wins back then, who never learned how to decision make properly, can still beat players with low win counts for one key reason. A high level of parkour consistency skill is needed to leave the early game stage of a 1v1 with 11 double jumps left. You need to be able to last up to that point without making many mistakes, which requires lots of practice and experience in TNT. At certain points in this video, I said terms like beginner, intermediate, and advanced or top level players. And in my opinion, beginners should only focus on parkour consistency and practicing the simple jumps and simple blocks to clear a map. Intermediate players still have parkour consistency issues, but they make little enough mistakes to have other skills influence results in their games. And I recommend these players to broaden their focus to the other 4 skills, and try to develop a solid B2B, practice cutting nons, and try optimize their pathing and decision making. Advanced players, who I'd say they're about 50 right now, are so good at parkour consistency that it should not be a focus for them at all, and they should try and focus on mastering all their weaknesses in the other skills, and also look at parkour mastery for one. Looking back at my TNT Run career, I was in the beginner stage until around 3,000 wins, and even now at 10,000 wins, I'd say I'm on the border between intermediate and advanced player. Admittedly, I would say I'm a slower improver than average, and the very top players generally get a good hold of parkour very early on, but this can be made up for with raw experience, which can be shown through players like Cool Survivor, Aetior, and Pipey. It's impossible for me to know what's exactly best for every player, but it's a good idea to take an honest look at your abilities and evaluate this for yourself. I'm not sure what kind of video relating to this I want to make in the future, but if enough people want it, I can make a video that's like this, but how the 5 skills apply to PvP specifically, or I could even dive into all the 5 skills individually in their own videos and have lots of specific examples and help you gain a more complex, deeper understanding of them individually. Let me know in the comments.